Okay, in the second session, we're going to stick, in a sense, with 1989. And I want to talk specifically about Romania today and talk about how and why 1989 in Romania looked very different from the way it did in the countries that we talked about in the preceding sessions. So very different from Czechoslovakia, very different from Hungary, very different from very different from Poland. Different in the sense that the end was not a velvet. It was not a peaceful process. It involved confusion. It involved fighting. It involved violence, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. It has a lot to do with one man and his egregious family, and we're going to meet him in a minute and find out exactly what is going on there. But before I begin, I just want to mention that literally in the last 30 or so minutes, a colleague of mine who is a very fine scholar of gender in Romania, a scholar called Jill Massino, if you're interested in her work, has just sent me an article which I've only half read, by a scholar called Marius Stan, who is talking exactly about what I want to talk about today, 1989 Romania, and whether or not this represents an exception. So I've posted that below this lecture on the Moodle page, and for those of you who are interested in Romania and in 1989, this looks to me to be a fascinating article. I really learned a lot from it, and I believe that you could all learn something from it too. So this is quite a happy coincidence, a little bit of an extra that I can offer you for this session. Okay, let's have a look then. Romania, in slide number 2. Here is the country that we're looking at, the state of Romania. Now, we haven't really talked about it much at all, have we? It hasn't really featured to a great deal on in our discussions to date. But what I could say about Romania is the following thing: it sort of became an independent state in the middle of the 19th century. Parts of it had been under the Ottoman Empire, and parts of it had been under the Habsburg Empire. So Transylvania, the Western territories, quite large Western territories. Its states had expanded greatly at the end of the First World War. It had incorporated all of Transylvania and large parts of a region called Dobruja, which is in the east of the country, on the Bulgarian border, close to the Black Sea. It had been allied with for most of the Second War. It had been allied with the Axis, with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Right at the very end, the Romanians had changed sides, fought with considerable bravery, mainly against the sort of the Nazis, and had sort of emerged in this way, and it was very similar to what they'd done in the First World War, changed sides at the very last minute. The Communist Party had never been big in Romania. In fact, it had been tiny. So the political society and the political forces in 19th century Romania and in interwar Romania were led by other people, by peasant parties, by liberal parties, by other forces, and the Communist Party had always been pretty tiny. But nevertheless, with considerable help from the Red Army and from the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War, the small Romanian Communist Party had achieved power and had taken control of Romania at the end of the Second World War, and of course would remain in power right up until the end of the 1980s. And many of the same things that we've talked about. Of course, the Communist Party now expanded because it was obviously in control, and started to sort of redesign and rebuild the country. Now, if we jump forward slightly, until the middle of the 1960s, the star, for want of a better word, of today's lecture comes to power. In 1965, Nicolae Ceausescu, a relatively young communist leader, took power in Romania. Now, Ceausescu had risen up through the ranks of the Communist Party, but he kind of came to power and quickly emerged as a sort of reforming figure. Ceausescu was somebody who wanted to increase the sort of prestige and increase the position and increase the autonomy of Romania on the international stage. He didn't exactly want to break away from the bloc. He didn't want to be like Tito insofar as he wanted to sort of leave the Soviet bloc. But at the same time, he did like many of the independent lines and many of the independent positions that Tito had taken, and he saw in Tito and he saw in Yugoslavia a possible example for Romania to emulate. Now, this was one of the core governing principles of Ceausescu's reign from the middle of the 1960s right up until its bitter end at the end of 1989. Ceausescu, in his foreign policies, but also in his domestic policies, strove to attempt to sort of carve out an autonomous position and an independent position within the Eastern Bloc, to be his own man, to direct the fate of Romania. So not unlike Tito, I guess in a sense, not unlike Enver Hoxha in communist Albania, but quite unlike many of the other leaders in places like Poland, in places like Czechoslovakia, who most of the time were largely loyal to whoever was in power, to whoever was ruling in Moscow. Now, in the big moment, the big show, the big display of autonomous policy, an autonomous direction, an independent-minded direction, came in August 1968. So this is at the same time, of course, as the Warsaw Treaty Organization of invasion of Czechoslovakia. Ceausescu very famously resisted Romanian involvement in the invasion. There were no Romanian troops sent into Czechoslovakia, and Ceausescu made a speech in Bucharest, in which the capital, of course, of Romania, in which he denounced the Soviet invasion. Now, Ceausescu very clearly had his own path in mind. What was happening in Ceausescu's Romania was nowhere near as dramatic and nowhere near, frankly, as exciting as what had been happening in Czechoslovakia. But nevertheless, Ceausescu saw himself as an independent-minded communist leader, a communist leader who would think of his country first and foremost, and wanted to sort of demonstrate this independent-mindedness by sort of resisting and protesting the Warsaw Treaty Organization of Czechoslovakia. So he was very much a maverick on the bloc, and we will see that there were some heavy prices to be paid, but there were also some certain dividends to be paid in this independent-minded policy. Now, the other thing that Ceausescu became interested in was himself. And his own reputation and his own personality cult, for want of a better word. In the I can't remember exactly when it was, late 60s maybe or early 70s, Ceausescu visited North Korea, which at the time was ruled over by the grandfather of the present leader. I think it was the grandfather, so I can't remember which one it is, Kim Il-sung or something like this. And North Korea then, as now, was a communist state, one that was ruled essentially by dynastic principle. The Kim dynasty, which of course is still in power, elaborated around itself a very involved in a very trenchant and a very pervasive personality cult. So statues, movies, music, posters, slogans, ubiquity in the press and the television. Ceausescu saw what was happening in North Korea. He saw how this personality cult had been developed, and he believed that this was a good way of shoring up his own legitimacy in Romania. That if he was to come back to the country and begin to cultivate the same kind of all-pervasive personality cult that surrounded the North Korean leadership, that this would be a means of sort of promoting his own legitimacy. Now, of course, there are personality cults of various scale and size. Tito had a personality cult. Enver Hoxha, of course, had a personality cult. To a certain extent, people like Todor Zhivkov and other Janusz Kadar and Erich Honecker, they also had certain aspects of a personality cult surrounding them, but they were not as potent as the one that Tito or Hoxha or Ceausescu developed. In this slide number 5, I've created. I've put in a link which can take you to some of the manifestations of this personality cult. And like I say, it's extremely potent, extremely all-pervasive. To live in Romania under Ceausescu in the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s is to be in constant contact with images and sightings of the great leader of Nicolae Ceausescu. Now, he was also, his family, Elena Ceausescu was the name of his wife, and she was a scientist, and she was also an essential component of this personality cult. It was very much a family affair. Now, like I say, it did have some dividends. In slide number 6, we can see the cover of Time magazine, which is a pretty conservative journal published in the United States. The Time magazine was quite impressed with what Ceausescu seemed to be achieving. It was like a new kid on the block, somebody who was willing to depart from the orthodoxies of the Soviet Union, the orthodoxies and the dogma of the rest of the Eastern Bloc, and that this seemed to be something that was worth commenting on, and perhaps something a little bit different from what was going on in the rest of the rest of the Eastern Bloc, and in a relatively canny way, not unlike Tito, Ceausescu was able to cultivate a position for Romania on the world stage, so that by the time we get to the 70s and the 1980s, Romania has what was called most favored nation state status within the bloc. So all the bloc is the same, but Romania is slightly better in terms of trading and diplomacy and culture and this kind of thing. Most favored with the West, I mean. Now, a few things kind of changed. As part of this independent line, for Ceausescu, in order to uphold this independent line, it was essential also to have economic independence. It was essential for the country not to be indebted to the West or to the Soviet Union. And in Ceausescu's mind, to keep the country out of debt was to be able, to sort of have greater autonomy and greater control over the national, over foreign policy and over the direction of the country. If they could stay out of these, stay out of these problems, stay out of debt, they would be able to sort of, this was an essential part of forging this independent line. Now, Ceausescu would look at countries like Poland, for example, or even Hungary, whose economies were in dire straits, in the 70s and the 1980s, and he would sort of see that as a negative example of something that they should, at all costs, they should try to avoid. The problems that Poland was facing with solidarity and with martial law and with rationing had to do with the failures of the Polish economy to keep itself out of the red. And if Romania was to sort of, if the dictatorship, if autonomy, if all of these things were to be upheld in Romania, it would also be necessary to sort of maintain economic independence. Now, all of that sounds sensible and logical, but in practice, what this meant was that in order to stay out of foreign debt, Ceausescu had to drastically reduce public spending and national spending. He had to come up with budgets that were way below what was needed to carry on with the modernization and to carry on with the development of the Romanian state. It was the only way he could achieve this positive equity at the end at the end of his various cycles of budgets. So in order to do this, Ceausescu imposed upon the Romanian people a savage policy of austerity, minimal public spending, minimal money for public services, minimal wages for the public sector, which was, of course, was almost all of gainful employment in Romania, in order to achieve the economic goals that Ceausescu and his regime had set for itself. The Romanian people would have to undergo this policy of incredible austerity. Now, what that meant was that in the country at large, rather than going forwards, the country was really going backwards. The roads were disastrous, covered in potholes. In any case, you couldn't drive cars on them because no one could afford cars. People were going around in horse and cart. The country was electrified, but electrification was subject to rolling blackouts. Most of the time, people were using candles to light their homes. Television, forget it. In many cases, running water, indoor plumbing, all of these sorts of things were rare luxuries, unless, of course, you were part of the ruling elite, unless, of course, you were part of the Communist Party nomenclature, part of the upper echelons of the Communist Party. Now, again, that's a bit of a given, the claim of the communists when they came to power, is that they would build a brighter and better future for their people and for the people that they governed. This was very atavistic. This was going retrograde, right? This was going in the other direction. The country was not getting more prosperous. It was not getting modernized. As for whatever problems, for example, Albania or Yugoslavia or Bulgaria were having, they were at least pushing forwards in terms of modernization. Romania seemed to be going backwards. People were suffering very terribly under Ceausescu's policies of enforced austerity. Now, all of this was taking place in conjunction with the elaboration of Ceausescu's personality cult. So it's almost like two stories are being told here. There's the fantasy story of the personality cult, wherein the country is prosperous and happy, and enlightened leadership of the Ceausescus is forging forwards into a brighter future. But at the same time, the Romanian people are suffering under austerity. There's no money, there's no public services, there's no transport, there's no nothing. The country is getting more and more, falling deeper and deeper into this kind of mortifying poverty and mortifying squalor. Now, one of the best examples, or rather the worst examples, of this disjunct between lived realities and the sort of the public face of the regime was the Palace of Parliament. That's in slide number 7. Now, I don't know if anyone's been to Romania or been to Bucharest, but if you have, you simply can't miss this monster. It's the second largest government building in the world. The first is the Pentagon. It's largely unused. You can see that it has a kind of neo-Stalinist feel. Ceausescu built this in the middle of the 1980s at great expense to sort of demonstrate, if you like, the potency and the power and the authority of his own regime. So in a sense, you can kind of imagine that on the one hand, the people are living in abject poverty and don't have enough money to live with month by month, day by day. And at the same time, the regime is building these gigantic boondoggles, these white elephants, in the middle of the capital, and spending many millions of many billions, huge amounts of currency and money on doing these things. Of course, this building still stands. It is today half empty, although some of it does house the Romanian government, and it remains a sort of it's a tourist attraction actually, and I visited it, and I said you have to expect about 2 hours to walk around this thing. You can do tours as well. I've never been inside the Palace of Parliament, but you can if you want to. So that's a bit of a problem for Ceausescu, and it's becoming a worse problem. The country is impoverished, but at the same time, he's spending a lot of time and money developing his personality cult and developing the cosmetic face of this thing through projects like the Palace of Parliament. Now, the other thing, the other imposition on the Romanian people is also quite an important one. Ceausescu foresaw demographic problems within the country. It's in fact, it's a demographic problem which Central and Eastern Europe still face to this day, which is a shrinking population. And Ceausescu, saw that people were having less children, and the country was shrinking, and something needed to be done about this. Some kind of aggressive pro-natalist policy needed to be pursued to attempt to redress this declining, this population decline. Now, Ceausescu's answer to this was to pursue an extremely aggressive pro-natalist policy, which he would have claimed euphemistically was a means of encouraging women and families, of course, to have more children. But in reality, given the strictures of the Ceausescu dictatorship, given the extent to which it infiltrated people's public and personal lives, what these pro-natalist policies did, and they were pursued from the 1970s onwards, was essentially to sort of reduce Romanian women to baby-making machines. In order to get an apartment or welfare or any of the needed things, any of the needed financial supports from the state, they would have to produce sort of 5+ babies. And if they didn't, they couldn't sort of, they couldn't kind of, they couldn't exist. Ceausescu also criminalized abortion, and criminalized it in the sense that it was illegal to carry out an abortion for a doctor, for an abortionist to do that. But it was also illegal for a woman to have an abortion. And if she did, she could face jail time. Again, this was to attempt to sort of rule out the possibility that women would get pregnant and then abort the fetus, abort the baby, so that this pronatalist drive that the Ceausescu was pursuing would be slowed down. There was incredible violence involved in these policies. The Ceausescu era security police, were known as the Securitate. They would be positioned on maternity wards in Romanian hospitals, to keep track and to make sure that women were not having abortions performed on them. If a Romanian woman in the 1980s was to get pregnant and wanted to have an abortion, needed to have an abortion, it would be extremely perilous. She would have to go to an underground abortionist. It would have to be done in some hotel room in unsanitized and unsterilized conditions. It would be extremely expensive. The risks, not just the physical and the health risks, but the political risks that women would take to have an abortion were very great indeed. So this was a very violent policy, and it was a policy, of course, which was directed first and foremost against women and against women's bodies. In slide number 8, there's an excellent film, which is also a very bleak and difficult film to watch, but is nevertheless a classic. 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Won the Palme d'Or at Cannes about 10 or so years ago. And it is a story set over one afternoon of a young student. So again, a woman who would be the same age as many people, as many of you, as many people in this class, who gets pregnant. Through sort of lack of contraception and this kind of thing, and needs to undergo this illegal abortion, and does so, and her best friend takes her through this, and it's really a trip into hell. They have to gather up a huge amount of money. They go to this terribly sort of seedy hotel. They meet with the abortionist, who extorts them for money and then extorts them for sexual favors. It's a very grim movie, but it's also a very eye-opening account of the kind of peril and the kind of jeopardy that Romanian women would find themselves in as a result of Ceausescu's pro-natalist policies. And then the film also evokes the period in all of its grimness and all of its bleakness extremely well. So it's not a happy movie, but it's a very good movie. If you get a chance to see that, I can highly recommend as gaining an insight into Ceausescu's Romania in the 1980s. Okay. So how did it end? Well, it ended at around about the same time, but in very different circumstances. Romania has various churches. The majority of Romanians are Orthodox Christian, but there are also very large numbers of Catholics and Protestants living within the country, and many of the Protestants live in the Western Territories in Transylvania, and there's a large Hungarian minority living in Transylvania as well. The flashpoint came in a city in the Banat region of Romania called Timișoara, with a very large Protestant Lutheran community and a Protestant Lutheran church as well. The regime was put pressure on a Protestant pastor called Laszlo Tőkés, a Hungarian. Tried to remove him from his parish and move him to another part of the country. With everything that was happening in 1989, with perestroika, with the reforms that were taking place in the rest of the bloc, this move was staunchly protested by many people in Timișoara. People came out onto the streets and protested this. So the Tőkés affair, the affair of Laszlo Tőkés, the Protestant pastor, became a flashpoint for the beginning of sort of protests against the Ceausescu regime, and they became much more virulent and spread across the country in the weeks after Tőkés was, this attempted removal of Tőkés from his parish. And again, like I said, the context here is the reform and the changes that are taking place in the rest of the bloc. Now, the difference is that the Ceausescu is not like the Polish leadership. He's not like the Hungarian leadership, the communist leadership in those countries. It may be quite simply because decades of this personality cult has simply addled Ceausescu's mind, that he really believes his own hype, that he really believes he's some great genius of communism who is loved uniformly by all his people, when the reality is the people are eking out a miserable existence in this impoverished Balkan state, and many of them are extremely resentful of the Securitate, of Ceausescu's leadership, of many things that are happening within the country. But essentially, Ceausescu does not back down, and there are various parts of the Ceausescu regime, the Securitate, the army, who, at least initially, think that Ceausescu is going to be able to sort of weather this storm, that it's going to be like the Chinese Communist Party in Tiananmen Square, that somehow Ceausescu is going to win over the people, somehow Ceausescu is going to stay in power. So, unlike in Poland, unlike in Hungary, unlike in Czechoslovakia, unlike in Bulgaria, unlike in the rest of the bloc, the security forces fight back against the protesters in Timișoara, and thereafter against the protesters when they arrive in the capital city, Bucharest. And as a result of this, there is a significant loss of life. But ultimately, over 1,000 people are killed during the Romanian Revolution of the winter of 1989. Now, in the middle of this is Ceausescu, unwilling to concede defeat. Doesn't it sound familiar, huh? Can we think of another person who's having a Ceausescu moment right now in the United States? It seems that he sincerely believes, as a matter of fact, that he is still the man, and that he is still loved by his people, and that indeed he just needs to sort of talk to them, and he can kind of keep power. Now, very famously, on the 21st of December, Ceausescu makes what would become his last speech, although, of course, he doesn't know it at the time. He's on the balcony of the government building in Bucharest. You can see him on slide number 10. In the far right is Elena, his wife, Ceausescu, of course, also an intrinsic part of the communist setup. And I've included a YouTube clip where you can sort of see, with subtitles, the highlights of this speech. And essentially what happens is initially Ceausescu comes out and there's a crowd beneath him, and he initially meets with a certain amount of support, and he begins to talk. And as it goes on, the people in this crowd become more and more restless. It's the reason they become restless is because it's clear that Ceausescu is not in step with the times. He's not offering anything new. In fact, all he's talking about are sort of communist party cliches. He's talking about quotas. He's talking about the next 5-year plan. He's talking, he's just spouting essentially Marxist cliches, and these are things that people have heard ad nauseum, and are not willing to hear it in the context of perestroika, in the context of the changes that appear to be taking place in the rest of the communist bloc. Now, it's quite incredible. You can sort of see the moment, because the crowd start booing him and start heckling him. It's not something that Ceausescu has ever experienced, or probably never dreamt of, that he would be faced with a hostile crowd in his own country. And it is quite a harrowing moment for him. So the crowd begin to boo, and it's really getting hot on that balcony. You can see that Ceausescu is beginning to sweat and is beginning to look extremely nervous and uncomfortable, not really understanding what's going on, too deeply embedded in his own hype, his own personality cult, basically beginning to panic as he experiences, what is. For the first time in his life, since he's been the leader, at least, of this country, meaningful public dissent and meaningful public protest against policies which he believed the Romanian people were sort of, the Romanian people were supporting. It is also, it seems, the moment that the sort of people in the security forces and the Securitate and the army begin to suspect actually that they may be backing the wrong horse. And that it is time perhaps to abandon Ceausescu because the people are turning against him. So Ceausescu flees. What happens next is very incredible and dramatic. He flees from this balcony and he is helicoptered away from Bucharest, he and Eleanor. And the plan is to go to a nuclear bunker, would you believe, out in the Carpathian Mountains and begin to try to organize the pushback against what he believes is a capitalist counter-revolution in the country. In the middle of all this, in the middle of this daring getaway, the Securitate and the army have decided that they need to remove Ceausescu and sacrifice him. That he's not going to survive this chaos. And indeed, the country is it's not clear what's going on. People are getting shot in the street. But the extent of the violence is unknown, and to many people, they think that this is actually tens of thousands of people that are killing, that the country is basically descending into a civil war. And to a certain extent, this is what Ceausescu believes as well. He just believes it's the people and the Communist Party against foreign invaders and counter-revolutionaries. This is how he perceives the situation. So this is basically what's happening. Now, these forces, which are becoming opposed to Ceausescu, form a group that is called the National Salvation Front, which is a very sort of creepy name indeed. And what happens is they instruct the pilot of Ceausescu's helicopter to land. He does. He feigns engine trouble. The helicopter lands in the middle of Romania. Nikolai and Eleanor hijack a car and start to try and drive towards their nuclear bunker. They are chased down by members of the National Security Front, and they are arrested, and they are sent to an army barracks in the middle of Romania. Now, in this final slide, their trial, for want of a better word, takes place on the 25th of December, so Christmas Day, 1989. The Romanian in the Orthodox calendar, the Romanian Orthodox calendar, Christmas Day comes on the 6th and the 7th of January. So it actually wasn't Christmas Day for them, but it was for much of the rest of the world, much of the rest of Europe at least. So the National Salvation Front subject Eleanor and Nikolai, this is in slide number 12, to a kangaroo court in which they accuse them of all kinds of fanciful crimes against the people of Romania. Of genocide, of starvation, of all kinds of, and this is taking place in the context of a very chaotic and a very confused period throughout the rest of the country. No one knows how many people have been killed. No one really knows who's in power, not even the National Salvation Front. The idea, of course, is to sort of put Ceausescu on trial, put him on television, and basically sacrifice him to show that he's not in control and that the game is up at least. The game is up at least for him. Now, if you're feeling particularly ghoulish, and I must admit that I wasn't, which is why I haven't put the link. You can go up to YouTube and you can watch this trial. It lasts for about 4 hours. Nikolai and Eleanor vehemently deny all of these charges that are put against them. At the end of the trial, they're found guilty. They are handcuffed. They are taken out into the yard and they are shot by firing squad. And as Nikolai Ceausescu dies, he's sort of singing the Internationale, so he's singing the communist revolutionary anthem. And that kind of puts a lid on things in a certain extent. The reign of Ceausescu obviously ended in extreme violence, unlike the way the communist regimes ended elsewhere. But the National Salvation Front, the group that had carried out this kangaroo court, this trial, comprising in the most part members of the old communist guard, so the Securitate, the officer corps of the communist army, essentially sort of stay in power. Many people have talked about in the 1990s, particularly, that what Romania underwent was like a stolen revolution. That the Communist Party never really relinquished power, and simply moved, sacrificed Ceausescu, and basically in the 1990s and well into the 21st century, the old rulers of the country remained. The rulers, they remained in power, and in this way, what happened in Romania, despite the dramatic scenes, despite the killing, despite the execution of the Ceausescus, was not a bona fide revolution. It was something like what people have called a stolen revolution. Okay, we'll end it there.